Hello, happy Pride Month. I am super excited to share with you a couple of cute things that I made to celebrate LGBTQ plus Pride Month, as well as talk about crafting as activism and movement making. In this video, I'm going to show you a couple of really cute Pride-themed patches that I made, one in embroidery, one in cross-stitch, and I'm going to show you some different techniques and tips for creating your own embroidered or cross-stitched patches, some different stitches that you can use at home, and the materials that you would need. Plus, I'll share a little bit about the history of needlework and crafted and artistic activism. Let's start with our craft projects. For this project, I will be using sparkly, can you see the sparkles? I don't know if you can. Sparkly Aida fabric, both for embroidery and for cross-stitch. I know it's supposed to be used for cross-stitch specifically, but we're going to use it for both, so don't at me or do whatever you want. I'll also be using a 3 or 4 inch little embroidery hoop, some colorful embroidery thread, a size 20 embroidery needle, some scissors, black ink pen shows up, maybe some transfer paper, pencil, all sorts of stuff. You'll see it in the video. Let's stitch. You can start off by sketching the design you want to embroider on printer paper. For Pride Month, I decided to draw a rainbow and a pride flag heart. And it's best to keep it simple, especially if you're just starting out, because that will be the easiest to follow along in the next step. Use scissors to cut out the designs so that they can fit in the center of your fabric. I'm going to use tape to attach the design to the fabric and then transfer paper to trace the design. The transfer paper I have has 2 sides and one side that should be placed down on the fabric. You should test out your transfer paper on a sheet of printer paper if you're not sure which side to use. I'm going over all of my line work and my words and my design with a pencil, pressing pretty hard to get the transfer paper to transfer the design onto the fabric underneath. You can also draw directly onto the Aida fabric with a normal pencil. This little flower guy ended up not fitting into my embroidery hoop, so I would suggest testing that out before you commit yourself to a really adorable design, but I'll probably use it for something else later. Place your fabric in an embroidery hoop with a solid hoop at the back of your fabric and the hoop with the screw in the front, like a craft sandwich. You're going to use the screw at the top to tighten the hoop onto the fabric and then adjust as needed by pulling the sides of the fabric down and making it a little bit tighter. For this first project, I'm going to embroider the rainbow pattern. I have a selection of different colors of embroidery thread, a size 20 tapestry needle, plus some scissors. For my rainbow pattern, I'll start by threading my needle with the pink thread. I measure out a couple of feet of thread, but not so much that it gets tangled. About 1.5 to 2 arms length works for me. To thread the needle, I'll first find the eye, the hole at one end of the needle. My method for threading is to flatten the end of the thread with my left thumb and forefinger and hold the needle in my right hand and place the eye directly over the end of the thread between my fingers, and then I push the thread through. I pull just enough thread through to have a few inches of tail, but I leave it pretty short. This might take a few tries to get it right, and some people find it easier to wet the end of the thread before feeding it through the eye. Next, I'll make a French knot to secure the end of my thread. I hold the needle in my right hand and the thread in my left, and I wind the end of the thread around the needle about 4 or 5 times. And then I pinch the wrapped thread with my left hand and use my right hand to pull the needle through the wrapped thread. When the thread is pulled all the way through, I end up with a little knot at the end. There are lots of other ways to tie a knot in the end of your thread, and knowing how to tie a French knot is very handy for all kinds of sewing projects. Now I can start stitching by first passing my needle through the fabric, coming from the back and through to the front. I follow the lines of my pattern and put the needle back through the fabric above where the needle came out of the fabric, leaving a stitch when I pull it through. Then I push the needle back through the fabric from the back, leaving a little space above my first stitch. From the front, I put the needle into the top hole of the last stitch and pull through to the back. This is the back stitch, and it's going to give me a dashed line to begin outlining the lines of my pattern. I'll continue this stitch all the way around my pattern in this one color, always making sure to leave one small gap between stitches that I then close to complete the back stitch. This is really essential to a lot of embroidery and cross stitch and sewing in general, so it's a great stitch to practice. When I get to the end, I'll use the same thread to now weave under each of the stitches, going under the thread, not through the fabric. This is going to turn the dashed line back stitch into a solid line whipped back stitch. It's whipping the thread around each of the stitches. I pass my needle and thread under each stitch all the way back around to the beginning and end by going back into the fabric at the very end. I really like this stitch for creating a solid line and for really pretty texture around the outline of my design. And it kind of keeps everything tidy and neat and looking pretty professional, or at least like I know what I'm doing. And it's a pretty simple, straightforward way to just kind of liven up your embroidery. Next, I'm going to fill in the color of my rainbow with this pink thread. I'm wanting to create a thick, solid band of color all the way up and over this rainbow in this pink. So I am starting from the back of the fabric, and I sew long straight stitches placed really close together to block in the color. If you wanted to try something different with texture, you could leave your stitches a little bit more open and loose so that you can see that sparkly Aida fabric sparkling through if you wanted, but I'm keeping mine pretty close together for something that looks like a satin stitch in embroidery. I'm also using these diagonal stitches because I think that they create an interesting texture for the rainbow. It seems to sort of radiate out from the middle. These are all choices you get to make when you are creating your own craft work. And try different things, experiment. As you're stitching, you'll probably end up running out of thread because that is the nature of thread, it is to run out. So when you get to near the end of your thread, maybe with 4 or 5 inches left, you're gonna work to the back of your work and pass your thread and needle underneath some of the stitches you've already made to secure the end, and then snip it off. I'll cut a new length of thread, again about 1.5 arm lengths is a pretty good length of thread to not get super tangly. I'll also make another French knot using the same method as before, and then continue where I left off. I'm using the same color that I started with. You could totally switch colors at this point, make it something kind of interesting, maybe different hues of pink would look pretty cool. But I'm going to continue on in this diagonal stitch all the way around my rainbow following the design of the pattern. When I finish filling in all one cover, I'll sew my needle to the back of the work again and then secure it down just like I did before and snip off the excess thread. Every now and then I like to pass my hand over the finished work because it's smooth and soft, and that's really pleasant. So give yourself that little treat if you're spending this much time making something really neat and unique. This is a 2-color rainbow. So for my second color band, I'm going with a light green that I think contrasts and complements the pink really nicely. I'm going to follow the same steps, pulling out a length of thread, French knot at the end, and then starting from the back of the work to the front, back stitching all along the inside of this pink band to create the outline of my green. I want my green and my pink to be right next to each other, but I want them to be really distinctive and look pretty neat. That's my goal. So I'm starting with the back stitch again, going all the way around the arch of this rainbow, just to the end. And once I get to the end, I'll do the whip just like I did with the pink by passing my thread and my needle underneath each of those back stitches so that instead of a dashed line, I get a solid line all the way around. Needlework craft, including embroidery like this, And cross stitch and quilting, as well as other fiber arts, have long been important symbols of resistance in counterculture and social justice movements. And that's why I chose these crafts to highlight for this Pride Month activity. They're things that we can do with our hands and that we can be pretty intimate with. And I think that it's important to be able to be close to the things that we make as often as we can be, so that we can really feel connected to the process, even if it takes a long time, even if it's a skill that we're not familiar with. These are important things to do to grow and to learn and to experience new things. Putting together videos for me has also been a little bit like stitching. It's something that I'm not super great at yet, but I'm always getting better and I'm always learning. Being able to share these crafts and practices like embroidery and illustration, knitting, things like this through videos and through classes and groups and just chatting with people is so empowering, and it's in keeping with the heart and tradition of handcrafted work. Handcrafted work like fiber arts and woodworking, decorative arts, things like that. It's all about sharing knowledge and skill, encouraging each other, trying new things, and learning from each other. Especially when it comes to something that carries a message, this closeness and intimacy with the work and being able to share it is super important. And so if this isn't something that you're totally used to or not something that you would normally get involved with, thank you so much for watching and for being part of the process of learning and growing with me. After I finish this green interior band, I thought that I would use the purple to stitch the words that I had included in the pattern that say "proud to be me," but that didn't work out at all. So I abandoned that pretty quickly and instead used a black pen to outline the words, because sometimes things just, they don't work out and you have to make do with what you have. I'm going to finish off this embroidery with some yellow thread that's done in the whipped backstitch again to outline the clouds. But I chose to leave these clouds not filled in so that the sparkly Ada could show through. And you just get this nice little shape of clouds right at the end of the rainbow. I think this turned out pretty adorable. So next I'm going to make my pride flag heart pattern, this time using cross stitch, which Ada fabric is usually used for. I fit some of the blank Ada into the embroidery hoop, and I have my cross stitch pattern nearby. The pattern shows me what colors I'll need, and for this pattern I'm using the colors of the transgender pride flag, which includes light blue, pink, and white, or in this case a little bit of cream. I'm starting at the bottom of my pattern with the light blue, which I cut a length of and thread through my needle and tied off with a French knot. If you look closely at the pattern and at the Ada, you'll see that the pattern is in a grid that matches the grid of holes in the fabric. Each tiny hole in the fabric is a corner of one of the boxes in the pattern's grid. So my first stitch is making a little X between the 4 holes at the corners of one box on the fabric with the blue thread. The pattern for this heart flag is in the description of the video, so you can take a closer look. I'm following the pattern to know which boxes to stitch little X's into. Each colored in box on the pattern should be a little X. The bottom point of the heart is 2 boxes or 2 X's next to each other, and then they increase by 2 for each row above the first. So that's where I'm starting. I work row by row to keep track of where I am in the pattern, and I count my stitches a lot. I check the pattern frequently to make sure I'm following along and staying on track. And in these first few rows, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see how the shape is coming together. And so having the pattern nearby just to check really helps to keep things in order. The pattern shows 5 rows of blue at the bottom of the heart, so I know to make 5 rows of blue stitches in my cross stitch. When I finish the 5 rows, I tie off the blue and I'll switch to the pink to continue following the pattern. And then I'll do the same when I finish the 4 rows in the pink and switch to the right for the center stripe, all the way to the top crest of the heart. Needlework and other handcraft work are distinguished from the fine arts, where the fine arts are things like painting and sculpture, and they say big things and they are important. And craft, which is things like woodworking or fiber arts that are domestic and personal. Because of this distinction, and because needlework is a craft, it's considered outside that white-centric, patriarchal world of work and art with a big A that's traditionally been dominated by a heteronormative, white male-centric perspective. This outsideness has meant that needlework has had a continual role as the actual banner flag of movement groups like the suffragists and counterculture youth of the 1960s. British art historian Rosika Parker, in her deep dive into the tangled history of embroidery and white femininity, The Subversive Stitch, says, "Embroidery showed that the personal was the political, that personal and domestic life is as much the product of the institutions and ideologies of our society as is public life." Parker's book was published in the mid-1980s, and she was looking back on the New Women's Live movement of the 1970s, focusing specifically on the experiences of white heteronormative women. Beyond the scope of Parker's research, crafting has been intricately woven into movements of resistance throughout history. In the United States, quilting was used as a tool of resistance against the oppression of slavery to mark safe houses on the Underground Railroad, offering beacons of freedom to enslaved people. Ruth Terry, in a 2019 article on Medium, connects research in neuroscience that suggests needlework supports mental health resiliency in coping with trauma, and that enslaved women who would knit and sew together may have experienced these benefits in the midst of generations of slavery and abuse. In 1987, gay rights activist Cleve Jones created the first panel of the AIDS memorial quilt in memory of his friend Marvin Feldman, and in response to the devastating AIDS epidemic that had reached its height in the mid-1980s. The quilt had been conceived as a way to remember the names of the lost, and public response was overwhelming as people throughout the U.S. sent panels to the San Francisco workshop, and donors supplied sewing equipment to construct the quilt. The quilt was first displayed in 1988 and has since grown with continued contributions. In 2019, the quilt weighed 54 tons and included 50,000 panels, each memorializing a beloved who had been affected by AIDS. In 2003, while a sociology student at Goldsmiths College in London, Betsy Greer coined the term craftivism as she wondered how she could use her knitting and fiber arts work to help others. In 2018, Greer curated an exhibit at the MoDA in Atlanta, collecting works by artists and crafters on issues of social and political inequalities. In an interview about the exhibit, Greer said, "These objects show how deeply the makers care about the various issues by the time spent and ideas shared. It is my hope that, shown together, the works help people talk about difficult issues, that the show may evoke or get people thinking about how they can express their feelings with what they can make with their hands." The Yarn Mission, a community knitting collective, formed in 2014 following the murder of Mike Brown and the protest response in Ferguson, Missouri. The collective is focused on community organizing and providing safe spaces for Black protesters to be together and support each other, all centered on shared knitting practices. Knitting kept hands busy, calmed spirits, and created a positive point of connection between complete strangers brought together by the protests. Eventually, Ferguson protesters and residents became like family, working together to keep streets clean, get to cars safely, and ensure everyone had necessities like toilet paper. There is so much more I want to say about crafting and about how making things with our hands can be radical acts of love and defiance. This is just the tiniest sampling of craft that has been created alongside incredible movements for the work of justice and community. I hope that this inspires you to keep learning about movements and practicing ways to make things with your hands and getting involved with issues that are really important to you. With the cross stitch done, I can keep it on the hoop as a wall hanging, which would be legit, but I think for these two, I am really into making them as patches for clothing. So I removed them both from the embroidery hoops, and I'll start off by trimming the excess fabric around the stitching. I'm leaving quite a bit of fabric still around the stitching just so I can trim it up a little bit more after I have bonded the adhesive to them. To make these iron-on patches, I'm using Heat and Bond iron-on adhesive. Taking a look at this sheet, I can see that there's two sides, one that's textured with tiny bumps or lines, and the other side is smooth paper like sticker back paper. I place my needlework onto the bumpy side of the Heat and Bond, and I use it to cut out the same shape from the Heat and Bond sheet. Next, I place a sheet of printer paper or parchment paper onto my friend's ironing board because apparently I don't have an iron or an ironing board. And I place my stitches and the Heat and Bond onto the printer paper with the front of the needlework face down, the bumpy side of the Heat and Bond against the back of the needlework, and the smooth paper side of the Heat and Bond face up, like a fabric and glue paper sandwich. I set my friend's iron to not steam, and then I set the heat dial to somewhere in the middle. On this iron, it says nylon, but about medium heat should work. Follow the directions on the Heat and Bond. When the iron is heated, I press it to the back of the paper on the Heat and Bond, making these little swirls because I really don't know how to use an iron, and this seems right. When and only when the patches have cooled completely can you pick them up and start trimming away the excess fabric. It bears repeating, don't pick up molten glue patches before they have cooled. Just let them cool, and don't burn yourself with molten glue. These patches are really adorable and happy and so pride, and I'm really excited about them. You can peel away the back of the Heat and Bond, and you can see the glue has adhered to the back of the stitches, which is exactly what it's supposed to do, so that's great. Patches need to go somewhere, of course, and so the best place for that is the butt pocket of my jeans. I place the patches on the pocket where I want them to stick, and at first I'm playing it real safe by using the iron on a low setting and the printer paper, but then I realize it's not getting hot enough to melt the glue on the patch, so I turn up the heat and go back over the patch with the iron until it looks like it will never move. When the patches have cooled, you can stitch around them to make them really stick to the fabric, or you can play fast and loose like I do and just not do that. It's totally up to you. I also made these cool coloring stickers for my local library's Pride art craft kit. These are really neat because if you use a waterproof media like colored pencils or crayons, they stay waterproof and they look really beautiful. You can customize them. I'm pretty proud of them. You can stick them to your water bottle and get a little bit of color on that thing. And then just to prove it, you could just run your water bottle underneath water. That's not how you fill a water bottle. Waterproof. Thank you so much for watching and for stitching along with me. Hopefully you made something really cool that you're very proud to wear or to add to a backpack, or maybe just to have up as a little decorative piece in your home. I'm really excited about the things that I made, and thank you for watching. These videos are fun to make. I don't know what else to say. It's Pride Month. Happy Pride Month. Like, subscribe, follow, Patreon. Thanks.